Welcome to Get Started Investing, a podcast where we cover everything that you need to know to start your investing journey. We cut through the noise to help you take the next step and have a bit of fun along the way. And boy, are we in for a fun episode today. We're talking about the finances of parenthood with a special guest. My name is Bryce, and to chat through it, as always, I'm joined by my equity buddy, Ren. How are you going?
I'm good, Bryce. I'm very excited for this episode. We are talking about one of the biggest financial decisions that you'll make and that we should all start planning for, and that is starting a family and having children, something that neither of us have expertise in. But luckily, we do have an expert who has literally written the book on the subject. Anna Kresina, welcome to Get Started Investing.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Anna is the author of Kids Ain't Cheap and How to Not Work Forever. But today...
Hold on, we should be clear. Those are two separate books, not just
yes.
one book that covers a lot.
Yeah. No, today we're focusing on Kids Ain't Cheap, how to plan financially for parenthood and your family's future. But we want to contextualize the conversation, Anna, because we're in a bit of a baby drought here in Australia. 2023 was the lowest level since 2006, and the drop between 2022 and 2023 of 4.6% was the largest annual drop since 1975. So while there are numerous contributing factors to this, survey after survey tells us that cost is the biggest driver.
Yeah, so with that in mind, we asked a question of an advisor recently, how can you prepare financially for children? And the reaction was mixed, which surprised us a bit. A lot of people telling us like this isn't the right question to ask. And so Anna, to kick it off, why is this the right question to be asking?
Yeah, I think that's great because I know exactly what reel you're talking about. I went to take a look and the question was slightly different. So it wasn't how can you prepare financially for kids, but when do you know you're ready to have kids financially? And I think that is more of a loaded question, right? Because you're never ready. Like, when are you ready? You're never ready until you make that decision. And the financial impact that has on your life can be huge because as we know, kids ain't cheap. And some people, they accidentally fall pregnant and they have to just adjust, and other people plan. And there's a lot of considerations that need to be taken into place. So how can you prepare financially for kids? Well, there's a lot of the financial literature is around just keeping costs low, spend within your means. All of that makes complete sense, but you'll never know when you're ready. So you just sometimes have to take the plunge.
Are there some key pillars, though, that we can think about in terms of getting our finances sorted before having kids? Like, rather than just going into it blind and then figuring it out as we go, what are some of those key things we can be thinking about, even if it is far down the track?
Yeah, great question. I think one of the first questions is you kind of have to look at your own finances. What are your expenses? Do you have any consumer debt? Can you pay it off? What are your short-term and long-term goals? Because those will change when you have a family. There's no doubt about it. The way that you think about your kids and your life definitely changes. And also thinking about your career and what that looks like. Now, let's take it a step back. If you are partnered and if you're planning on having kids with a partner, conversations with your partner should be number one. That's something that you don't want to neglect because having different values or ideas around money or how you want to spend money or how you want to raise your child is going to have a massive impact on that. So setting some of those expectations up front, talking about it, because money can be very stressful. And when you're sleep deprived and when you don't have time and it can really impact your relationship, as so many people divorce in the first couple of years of having kids. And that's due to the financial stress, due to the emotional kind of burden of changing your life and how you are situated in a family kind of system. So those first conversations are so, so important to have.
It's daunting thinking about it. And like the conversation is so much bigger than the financial side of it. And, you're talking there about the conversations you and your partner should be having and the goals you should be setting. And, that's more than financial. But obviously, like, getting your finances in order is an enabler of a lot of those achieving those goals, or at least it's giving your family choice in the future. Now, we've done, I think, close to 300 episodes on Get Started Investing. And I think we've spoken about a lot of the sort of core pillars of personal finance with or without a family. Spend less than you earn, invest the difference, get the insurance right. A lot of those sort of basics. Max out your super if you can. For people who feel like they've got those basics in order, what are some of the additional steps, additional considerations, or additional conversations that we should be having when it's time to start planning for families?
Yeah, great question, because this is exactly how I felt. Having my first kid, I was like, I got my finances in order. I'm on the way to fire. I'm going to, I can retire early in a few years. The only thing I don't have ticked off is my own house. I had a rental property. So I was like, I've got this. It's great. And then you realize that there's so many rules around paid parental leave, around childcare subsidy, and all of those are impacted based on your income. So you really need to think about your income and your income threshold in order to understand what subsidies you're able to get and how much of that. Running numbers around early childhood education and care, or childcare, is really important as well, because it's so expensive. You don't actually realize how expensive childcare is. At one point, I think it was the equivalent of my rent. I could not believe that. I mean, even if you run the numbers, okay, it's expensive, but once you see the equivalent of your rent coming out of your paycheck month after month, it is so hard to swallow, especially for 4 or 5 years, depending on how long you have your kid in early education. So running those numbers is really important. And then there's really surprises along the way, like you pay for public holidays for childcare. The cost of the childcare depends on how many hours it's open for. So whether you go to a childcare center that is 10 hours or 12 hours, that's going to impact your subsidy and how much you pay out of pocket. There's also sick and carers leave. You're going to take a lot of it. Your kid gets sick all the time. That's going to impact your earning capacity. That's going to impact your job. And then especially if you're a woman, how that's going to impact your career in the future. And that was something that I was really surprised about as someone who's very career driven, being like, whoa, some of your priorities change. My ability to earn more or to advance in my career is changed a little bit within that as well. So thinking about that all up front is really important. But just to go back to talking about paid parental leave and childcare subsidy, because it is linked to your income, there are certain things you might want to consider ahead of time. So one of the things for me was, I was working at a startup. It was great. I got a bunch of options paid out to me. And as I was kind of leaving jobs, I needed to sell them in order to exercise them and get the benefits. Plus, we were buying a house. And in doing that, I didn't realize that that would impact my paid parental leave and my childcare subsidy. So I got 0 paid parental leave for my second child, and I had to pay full childcare subsidy prices. Now, very grateful that I'm in a situation where I can financially do something of that sort, but the tax implications of that almost made it not worth it. Had it been any other year, had I did better tax planning, I would have had a better outcome. Now, I'm not the first person who's done this, right? You want to create better choices for your family. You want to have better opportunities. So you do some of those things, but you don't realize that the lead-on effect of that. There's a lot of people who take paid parental leave, and that's great, or their company will support them, which is really important to kind of look at, like, what are you able to get paid any leave during that time? But the thing is, if you don't, you're going to really have to plan for how long you want to take off. So there's a lot of additional planning that comes into place around that.
And so, Anna, who are the professionals that someone can go and speak to understand some of these questions? And is it just a financial advisor? Is it a tax professional? Is there someone in between that's not going to cost $4,000 in a statement of advice? Like,
Yeah.
Asking for a friend.
Asking for a friend. There's this book. It's called Kids Ain't Cheap.
Yeah,
It talks a lot about that stuff. But yeah, I think talking to a tax accountant or a financial advisor is really helpful if you can. The other part is just getting financially educated, right? Like listening to this podcast and getting some of that information up front. Because I don't even know if my tax accountant would have caught that would impact my childcare subsidy in some cases, right? Depending on what industry or what you're looking at.
That's kind of what my point of the question was, though. It sounds like trying to educate yourself on this could actually be you could go down a lot of rabbit holes. And if a tax guy can't pick it up, like,
I know there's a couple financial advisors who are younger women, have families who are much well kind of versed in this space. So that's why it's important to just have those conversations and have those diverse voices, because this was not something I thought about. I never really thought about the impact of doing something that I think will benefit my family, like selling shares and getting a new house, and how that's going to actually negatively impact us.
Yeah, I think there's so many layers of complexity there, because it's not only tax planning, which is complex, but then it's like family planning on top of that. But then also add in the fact that it was like a startup and it was options, which are like
Yeah.
relatively new in the financial planning space in Australia, at least compared to how well known they are in America. It's like
For sure.
yeah. So, and I guess you mentioned you've had 2 children. Before you had kids, you thought you had your finances in a pretty good place. You were on the path to FIRE. I'm gonna hazard a guess that maybe FIRE isn't the at least medium term goal anymore. But looking back at your younger self, what do you wish you could go back and tell that version of Anna?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question, because so much of life is about like living your life to the fullest, but also planning for the future, or at least it has been for me. So I'm an avid traveler. I've traveled to over 50 plus countries. I've obviously came from Canada, lived in a different country, which is great. So I've done all those things. And I think it's really important to know what your values are and therefore plan your life around that. And that was something that was important to me. So when I settled down to have kids, and I got that a lot out of my system, because now that you have kids, traveling is much more expensive. And it's not fun. I'm going to be completely honest. You don't want to babysit your kids in a foreign country, in a foreign hotel. It sucks. It sucks. It sucks. The flip side of that is you obviously want to have a really great time with your kids. You want to show them new things. But I think getting as much of that stuff out of your system when you're younger is going to make you a better parent. It's going to make you more focused, and you're going to have less regret. No one wants to look back and be like, "I wish I took that trip." You want to be able to do that. And the reality is, when you become a parent, you just have less time, and having less time can impact your earning potential in that space as well. So taking risk, being able to try new jobs, being able to try the business you've always wanted when you were younger is probably a better thing to do than once you have kids, because all of a sudden you want security, you want stability, you want to be there for your family. And that's very different when you're single and by yourself or have no dependents. Even if you have a partner, you can take more of that risk. So that's just one of those things that I've followed that quite a bit, but if anyone else wanted to think about that before having kids, I think it's really important.
You mentioned that you were, pursuing FIRE. Before kids, how did you think about factoring in the cost of kids into your FIRE journey? Or did you grossly under or overestimate actually the impact on your FIRE journey?
Originally, when I realized that I wanted to have kids, I was single. So I had no partner. And I thought, hey, if I want to have kids, it's going to cost me a lot. I'm going to need IVF. I'm going to need to go through that whole process. And that's quite expensive. So I already started squirreling money away, because I was thinking financially in terms of wanting to be able to take parental leave, having to pay for medical costs, and then creating a life for myself and my kid in that way. Luckily, I found a partner to have kids with who we're very much aligned in that space. But a lot of planning comes up front, because even now I'm just so surprised with the cost of kids, like the food wastage that happens, the fact that you have to drive them everywhere, the cost of holidays. It's not just like one quick cost where you're just going to use your points and it's free. It's like, now you've got 4 people. How are you going to navigate that? There's the additional domestic mental load that happens that gets it's now being talked about more, but it is who's going to do the laundry, who's going to get the kids ready, who's going to do the lunches. It just is overpowering of your life. So if you can navigate all of that ahead of time and have a bit of a plan, it makes it easier. My partner often refers to it as like death by 1,000 cuts, like all of these costs along the way that you don't think about. You're like, oh my God, you grew out of your shoes. Shoes are like $30 to $60, like kids clothes are exactly the same cost as adult clothes in many cases. So it's these little things along the way. So for me, as I was pursuing FIRE, I knew that it would cost a lot, but I didn't do the actual numbers and budgeting because it was just all over the place. It's too hard to really know how much is childcare going to cost? How much does it actually cost to raise a child? And that was something that I really wanted to kind of capture in my book.
I've got to say, Anna, you're not quite selling
Yeah.
the dream.
I'm not selling the kid thing. Yeah.
Yeah, you may be overwhelming us a little bit, but it's good. It's good. It's the reality of it. We've spoken about, I guess, the cost of having kids mainly in the context of how we can get ready to have kids. How can we prepare ourselves financially? But let's actually turn to the cost of the kids themselves. The title of your book is Kids Ain't Cheap. So first question, how not cheap are we talking?
About $500,000 to raise your kid to the age of 18. So
Jeez.
it's a lot of money. And that all depends, right? Like, do you want to go to public school or private school? Do you take your kids to extracurricular activities or not? Can you walk to school? All of those kind of depend. Now, yes, kids ain't cheap. Yes, it's a bit of a negative slant to that, but the truth is they can be so absolutely rewarding. I would have had none if that wasn't the case, right? But it's amazing to have these little humans in your life. But us as parents, we can navigate the financial stuff by being prepared for it, by being aware of it. So that $500,000 isn't upfront. Obviously, it's over a period of time. And if you can financially plan ahead of time, it just makes it easier to navigate.
Just to dig into that a little bit more, that 500,000, like what are the big factors of that? Is it private school? Is it not? Is it those examples that you spoke about? Like, what are the big drivers in that?
Yeah. So up front, one of the first things that people notice is the childcare cost. That's huge. But then over time, it is food, it is extracurricular activities, it's needing access to technology, school uniforms and excursions. That all takes place. It depends on what school you're going to go to. So even if you're going to a public school, there's still costs
Mm.
associated to that. It's not absolutely free, which was something that was new to me as I did research for the book and haven't grown up here, so I have absolutely no clue. So there are costs that add up over time, but they're less noticeable as kids get older. However, they increase as they get older. So you
Mm.
might have played a sport and it was quite cheap when your kid was 5 years old, but as they get more into it, it costs more. There's more trips to take. So it's just little things like that that add up over time.
Anna, you mentioned as kids get older, you sort of don't notice it as much, but it is getting more expensive. What are some of the most important things for parents to consider once they move into that later stage in life and get to the end, closer to the end of that $500,000 mark?
Yeah. Well, one of the things you can look forward to is that eventually your kid will leave the house, but
Get him in the
that's a well.
workforce. Get him in the workforce.
Get them in the workforce. Get them, get them out there. No, but in all seriousness, I think the best thing you can do as a parent is enable your child to understand financial literacy. And that is a big takeaway for kids, right? If you have financially literate parents who are teaching your kids are hopefully going to have better outcomes. Now, we can't deny the cost of living, climate. There's so many considerations and unknowns, AI being another one of what our kids are going to go through. So if we can kind of raise resilient kids, especially financially resilient kids, that's the best thing that we can do. So as parents, talking about money early and often, being really open about it, talking about any feelings you have around money, because we all have our money stories and hangups about it as well. So having that conversation is important, and just bringing them into the real world. Like, what is the reality of the costs of things? Taking them to the store, giving them a budget to kind of workshop what they can get for the money that they have are going to be some of the best skills that you can set your kid up for the future. So real life examples, having conversations, and also giving them autonomy to have money and make mistakes with money. We can't always handhold them. We need them to go out and make mistakes and learn from that, because you might see your kids spending all their money on Pokemon and you might be like, oh my gosh, you just blew so much money on this. Why? But that's important for your kid to then look back on and be like, well, I decided to spend money on that, or I could have bought a new bike. What do I want to do in that situation? And that's really important.
Well, Anna, the bad news is that statistically, the proportion of kids staying home later in life is also growing. So
Yeah.
whilst you might be planning that they leave the nest at 18
Yes.
and go off to uni, there's many, many stories. And I think statistically that age bracket of 30 to 35 is now growing pretty quickly.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, that obviously plays into cost of living and housing and all of that sort of stuff. But I remember reading an article recently in the AFR where parents hadn't planned for this part of their life for their kids to still be so dependent, in inverted commas, where they're trying to retire and do those sorts of things. So
look, Anna, we are almost out of time, and we want to say a massive thank you for joining us today. People can pick up your book, Kids Ain't Cheap, if they're, or wherever they are on thinking about starting a family, or if they've already started a family and they're realizing that kids aren't cheap. If there's any last advice or any bits of wisdom that you can share with us as Bryce and I start thinking about, families and the costs and getting ourselves ready, any last bits of advice you'd want to share?
Yeah, if you can plan ahead of time, that's probably the best thing that you can do. But if you're in the thick of it, no, it won't be forever. Yes, it'll get a bit easier, and you can get your kid to also work and pitch in for rent or mortgage as well. Getting them involved in the finances of the house is one of the most important things you can do as a parent to set them up for future success. So, yeah.
I remember when my mum and dad sat me down at the start of my gap year to try and get me to start paying rent, and I couldn't believe it. It was, I was like,
betrayed.
What? Are you kidding me? Yeah, betrayed. I couldn't believe it. Stormed out of the room, and anyway, I look back on that with a bit of regret.
He stormed out of the room all the way to India. Stayed there for a year.
Yeah, but they tried teaching me young, so full credit.
When you look back, do you think that was a valuable lesson? Like, how do you look back
I look
at that?
back on all of the lessons they taught me about money, and whilst at the time it was just like I cannot believe this.
Now he hosts a money podcast.
And I look back on it, I'm like, I can absolutely believe it, and I think that it certainly taught me the value of money and the role I play in society and in my own family. So
yeah. That's one of the craziest thing about being a parent is that you can't help but look back to the way that you were raised and what your parents did and how you want to raise your kids, whether it be financial or otherwise. You just can't help but compare and contrast and be like, what was the outcome of that for me, and how do I want that outcome to be for my kid?
Now, Anna, I know I did just wrap up, but I'm going to slip one more question in there because I've just remembered something that seems to always create controversy on social media. So I'm going to ask you, and then we'll clip it up and hopefully get some of that sweet social media engagement. I feel like a conversation that divides a lot of parenting groups and circles is paying kids for chores. On one side of the debate is you teach kids about working for money, and then you can use that to build good money habits. On the other hand, you hear people argue that it's like financializing something that should be about just like being part of the family and helping out. So to get us some of that great social media engagement, what do you think is the right approach?
I think it depends on your family. So I'm not going to be as controversial. One of the things I don't want to do in my house is pay my kids for chores that is expected of them. I'm happy to pay them for other things. And that can be monetary in other ways. It can be reading books. It can be, doing like creating something or being creative. It doesn't have to be household chores. Now, if your kid is not going to be not doing any of their chores and it's difficult and you need to pay them and that's the only way to get them done, sometimes you need to do those things, but you need to think about what that trade-off is. So it's hard because you want to teach them the value of money, but there are different ways to teach kids the value of money. Interesting enough is that the gender pay gap actually starts with chores. So I don't know if you know that, but often chores that are seen as more male dominant in the sense of mowing the lawn usually are paid more than ones that are more domestic, like folding the laundry or doing dishes. So even being aware of how much you're paying for what job might be really important as a parent to think about those gender roles and what we value when it comes to money as well.
Fascinating. Were you paid for chores?
I think so, but now that I think about it, not all chores, but I think mowing the lawn was one that I think I got some pocket money for. So.
Like a one-off.
Yeah, there you go. That's really interesting to think about. Well, Anna, a massive thank you for joining us. I'm sure we'll speak to you again, but until then, people can go and pick up your book if they want to read more from you. But yeah, massive thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Anna.